Marvelous medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen, once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant stewing pot. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. "Don't forget, you don't have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of those things. And how could you possibly do that?" "You keep out of this," cried Mr. Cranky. "We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we have it." This was George's marvelous medicine number 4, and when it had been boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out to the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty weird chickens around here if you go on like this," she said. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give a spoonful to that one over there." He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held the spoon with the new medicine on it. "Chick, chick," he said, "try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. "Ouch," it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. "Watch it grow," cried Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure," said Mrs. Cranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Keep quiet," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there staring at the brown hen. "It's getting smaller," George said. "Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. The next chapter is called Goodbye, Grandma. "There's still something you left out," said Mr. Cranky. "I can't think what it could be," George said. "I give up," Mrs. Cranky said. "Pack it in. You'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up, too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous, tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her and shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," said Mrs. Cranky. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho," she cried. "Ha, ha. So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. It's not for you." "Now you're against me, too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me from having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mrs. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, George," cried Grandma. "Don't," said Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's marvelous—" "Everything's George's around here," shouted Grandma. "George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, smiling hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," the other 2 cried. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drank 50 doses of George's marvelous medicine number 4. And look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You cooked the old girl's goat goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's gonna blow up, Mrs. Cranky said. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire department, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police. Man the hoses. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma started to get smaller. She'd started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping about the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, said Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Said Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do you think I feel? She yelled. How do you think I'd feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant one minute and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a pencil, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, How do I stop her from getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end and pull, said Mr. Cranky. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. Moments later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look in her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, Well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said, she most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of the magic world. And that's the end of George's Marvelous Medicine. Remember to take an AR test on it if you haven't already.